My name is Charles Harold with the Veterans History Project. Today is May 19th, 2007. I'm here near Weems, Virginia, interviewing Mr. Gibson about being a U.S. Marine during World War II. Mr. Gibson, for the record, would you state your full name?
Robert Newton Gibson.
And what is your current address?
Current address is Post Office Box 46, Weems, Virginia, 22576.
Where were you born, Mr. Gibson?
I was born in Wise, Virginia.
And when were you born?
Born October the 17th, 1919.
You're a veteran of World War II?
Yes.
What branch of service were you in?
I was in the U.S. Marine Corps.
When did you enlist?
I enlisted in August of 1942.
And when were you discharged?
I was discharged on January the 2nd, 1946.
And what was your highest rank?
Highest rank during the war was sergeant.
Did you serve in the Atlantic or Pacific?
I served in the Pacific only.
What campaign were you involved with?
Involved in the invasion of Iwo Jima.
What company were you assigned to?
I was with the Headquarters and Service Company, H&S Company, 26th Marine Regiment. That's the regimental headquarters company.
And you were assigned to which division?
I was in the communication section of that company, and I was in the radio, combat radio section. On Iwo Jima, my group, I had a radio that required 3 men. It was a 3-man radio setup. Used a hand crank generator and batteries for receiving. And I was a corporal then, going Iwo.
You were in 5th Marine Division at
5th
Iwo.
Marine Division is the 26th Marine Regiment is one of the 3 infantry regiments in the 5th Marine Division.
You also had other type of special duties before that time.
Well, I volunteered for the paratroops after I completed radio operator training, operator combat radios school. They offered 2 volunteers from each class that graduated from the radio school. 2 people were selected to become parachutists. So I volunteered and was one of the 2 who, out of my radio school class, was selected to go through parachute training. So in early 1943, I began to train as a parachutist and graduated in, I think, May of 42 because I had a little training accident which slowed me down a little bit.
We'll talk about that in a bit. What I'd like to do now is go back to your childhood as early as you can remember. Do you remember anything before the Great Depression hit?
Oh, yes. Well, one thing I remember when I was 4 years old, we were living in Lee County, Virginia. My father was a minister, and he received a call to a field of churches in King and Queen County, which was in eastern Virginia. And just a little before that, he bought a Model T Ford automobile. And when in the fall of in November, I think it was October or November, I'm not exactly sure which month, we moved from Lee County, Virginia, to King and Queen County. And this took about 5 days driving across the state at the time when there were no highway signs hardly, and very few, almost no paved roads. And this was in a rainy time of the year in the fall, and I remember driving through muddy roads and fording streams, because in those days if you had a little stream, if it wasn't too deep, you didn't go over it, you went through it, you know. There were a lot of fords where you would drive through. And those Ford cars, the Model T Fords, were built with pretty tall wheels so they could go through pretty deep water. And I remember going through those places. I remember there were no motels or hotels.
Where'd you sleep then?
Well, if we would stop and select a farmhouse that looked pretty good and knock on the door and ask people if we could rent a room for the night for the family. And there was my father and mother and 3 of us. I was 4 years old. My younger brother was 2. My older brother was 3 years older than me, so he was about 7 years old.
As a 4-year-old, that must have seemed like a great adventure.
Well, it was quite a change, yes, because that's my earliest memories was a few little vignettes from the place that we lived in Lee County, and then that trip across the state, and then finding our new home there in Shanghai, Virginia, which is a rural part of King and Queen County.
You said you were born in Wise County and lived in Lee County before you came east. Is that where your parents' families were?
My father's family lived in Lee County, which is the most western county of Virginia.
Did you know your grandparents?
I knew them, yes, I knew my both grandparents. My grandfather Gibson was also a Baptist minister.
What was his name?
His name was Robert Matthew Gibson. That's one of my sources of one of my names. The other grandfather was Newton Click, C-L-I-C-K, and he lived in Mulberry Gap, Tennessee, which is in Hancock County. And that's the other source of my middle name was Newton from him.
Did you visit these grandparents?
I visited. We tried to visit them. My father used to get a month vacation as a minister. He got about a month off during the summer, and we would usually try to drive from eastern Virginia to western Virginia during those vacations and visit the many relatives that we had, both in Tennessee and in Lee County, Virginia.
So it was pretty much a yearly thing.
It was once a year for 2-3 weeks.
So you didn't necessarily grow up with lots of cousins?
I didn't grow up being in close contact with them. In fact, I reestablished my connection to my cousins. I didn't see them at all during the Depression, and except for one or two aunts who would come and visit us. I never saw my two uncles during the Depression after my father died. We no longer went on these summer visits after he left the ministry.
Tell me about your grandmothers. Did you know them?
Yes, I knew one of them. My mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, died before I was old enough to know anything about it early in my life. But I knew the grandfather Gibson's wife.
What was her name?
Her name was Susie. She was a Fitz, married to Gibson. And she was a wonderful little cook, a little woman who was about a very slight, slender little lady. And I remember what a wonderful cook she was. And they lived in a house that was over 100 years old, and which was basically a 2-story log cabin. It was a large house, but it had been covered with weatherboarding. I didn't know until many years after this was actually a log house, but it was originally a log house built in the early 1800s, so it was almost a frontier house in that part of the state at that time.
Well, your grandparents would be almost old enough to be Civil War folks.
Well, one of my grand-uncles was a Civil War Confederate soldier. Uncle Zach was a Confederate soldier.
Did you ever meet him?
I met him, but only as a pretty young kid. I didn't really know much about him. But he was proud of having been a soldier in the Civil War.
Your granddaddy was a preacher with the Baptist church.
He was a Baptist minister.
Was he able to be stationed at one particular church?
Well, he was in quite a few churches. He had charges down in Lee County. I don't know where his first church was, because that was before I was born. He went to college at Harrogate, Tennessee, at Lincoln Memorial College in Harrogate, Tennessee, which is just below Cumberland Gap on one branch of US 25. And he was in Wise when I was born, and was there for a couple of years. In fact, a funny little sidelight, when I was about a year old, I was declared the best baby in Wise County, and my mother received a little gold locket that she kept for all of her life.
Do you still have that locket?
No, it got lost somewhere, so I don't have it. I wish I did, because it would be very precious. But and then Daddy was in Lee County after that, and that's where we moved back from there to Eastern Virginia to King and Queen, where we lived for about 3 years. And in 1926, we moved to Kilmarnock.
Did you ever see your granddad preach?
No.
No.
I never saw him preach.
But you saw your dad preach.
Many times. I have heard the same sermon 2 or 3 times because he had 3 churches in the field. And he might sometimes preach in 2 of them, often preached in 2 of them nearly every Sunday.
Did your dad ever tell you why he went into the ministry?
No, I was not old enough, during his lifetime to talk about such things.
Did your dad ever talk about growing up himself?
Well, not a whole lot, not to me anyway.
What was his name?
His name was Herbert H. Gibson.
How about your mom?
My mother's name was Julia Jessie Click, and she was the youngest of 6 daughters. And all of them lived to maturity, but one died as a young lady from tuberculosis. They didn't all marry, let's see. Most of them did, but I guess all of them did except the one who died. No, there was another one. The oldest one became an educator and was pioneered at building the school in the area where she grew up. She and my mother grew up, and she prevailed upon the farmers and people to contribute money and lumber and all that sort of thing, and they built a school in the 1920s there in Mulberry Gap. And in recognition of her prominence in this work and so forth in the mountain area of Tennessee, she was recognized as a Teacher of the Year in 1926 and received a gold medal from President Coolidge. This
is your aunt, right?
This is my aunt, my oldest
her
aunt. Her name was Ellen Click, and she spent her life in working to try to upgrade the mountain children in that area, in education, and also in later years when she quit teaching. She was a clearinghouse for, used clothes and things like that to distribute to poor mountain children.
Did your mom ever do any type of work before she got married?
Mother was qualified to teach in elementary schools in Tennessee, and tried it once or twice, but never pursued it as a career. She was a lifelong housewife. She never worked at anything except a little babysitting after my father died suddenly in 1934.
Tell me about your mother. What was she really good at?
Well, she was a good cook. She was a wonderful cook. She was a hard-working housekeeper. When we were experiencing difficult times in the 30s and lived in a house without running water and so forth, she had to draw water from the well and wash clothes for 3 young boys that needed new clean clothes every day, and she was a great housekeeper, and she was interested in reading. She was a great reader. She started me on a lifetime of being a devoted reader of all kinds of things.
Can you recall the stories she read to you as a kid? Was it like a nighttime thing for you?
Well, yeah, we loved to hear her read because she was a good reader. I mean, we liked the expression she gave. We read books like the Hardy Boys and that sort of thing when we were young, and I don't remember many other books, but she read a lot to us because this was before. It wasn't before radio, because we had radio, but we didn't sit around and listen to her like many people. We did a lot of reading, and at Christmas we looked forward to Christmas because we always got several books apiece.
When was your parents married?
They were married, I think, in 1911.
1911, before World War I.
Oh yes, several years before World War I.
By the time you came around, they had been married 8 years or so.
They had been married a good while. Yeah, I can't remember how old my mother was when I was born, but she was in her 30s.
So she was older then.
Yeah, she was older. Yeah.
So
they didn't have children immediately. They had one child, I think, that was stillborn in maybe the early part of the teens, in the 20th century, 1914 or something like that. Then they didn't have any more children until 1917, and the first child that survived was my older brother. His name was Hugh Edwin, and he was born in January 1917. I came along in about almost 3 years later, in late 1919, October 1919, my younger brother is 2 years younger. He was born in November of 1921. So there were three boys. And
Can you describe the home you lived in, the first one you can remember here in King and Queen or here in Eastern Virginia?
well, the first, I remember the home that we lived in Lee County, and I was 4 years old. It was a nice big farmhouse. It apparently had been owned by a pretty well-to-do farmer because it had lots of rooms, and it's now been restored, and it's a wonderful house. It's restored by a couple of old maids who lived down there. And
You've been to it since?
I've been to it since, and I've visited those ladies and talked with them.
Did it have power or electric or
Well, it didn't have power in those early days. No, nobody had power back there then. I mean, that was the coal oil lamps and lanterns and all that sort of thing. The rural electrification didn't take place until many years later than the years that, in that area anyway. A few years later anyway. I don't know when it happened exactly because.
How about in Eastern Virginia? Did you have power when you were living in Eastern Virginia?
I can't really remember. I think we did maybe in King and Queen. I believe we did. But I'll tell you an interesting thing about living in King and Queen. This was from late 23 until mid 26, about 3 years there that we lived there. But I remember that when we went to church on Sunday at Olivet Church, which was the church almost across the road from where we lived, where the parsonage was, I would see almost as many horse and buggies in the churchyard as I saw automobiles. There were a number of people who still came to church in horse and buggies rather than cars, because that was a rural county, and they liked their buggies and so forth. And everybody didn't get a car right away. It took a little time for that to happen. My memory goes back pretty far, you might say.
But your dad had a car.
Oh yeah, he had a car, because he had three churches and they were scattered, so he had driving to do every Sunday. And we had a Model T Ford first, and then he began to buy smaller cars. We had a couple of Whippets. I don't know if you know what a Whippet is, but it was made by an Overland company that made Willys Knight and that sort of stuff. We ended up in 1929 or 30 with a big, heavy Willys car, Willys Knight car, and that was the best car we had up to that time.
There in King and Queen, would you consider the neighborhood to be extremely poor?
Well, it was a working neighborhood. Yeah, people either worked in the woods, lumber, because there was a big paper plant at West Point, and there was a lot of pulpwood and stuff that was being cut. Most people were farmers at that time in King and Queen County. It was a rural county. I went to school there. My first year of school was in King and Queen County. Don't remember much about it, because I was only 5 years old when school started, and 6 years old when I finished it. And then after that, we came to Kilmarnock, and Kilmarnock at that time, the summer that we moved to Kilmarnock, they surfaced the streets. It was kind of a dirt street prior to that, but so we got there fairly early too.
In 27.
That was in 1926.
So up until 1926, it was dirt roads?
Well, I don't know for sure. They may have had some tar on it, but I remember distinctly how much tar we smelled during the first summer that we lived in Kilmarnock. And
is that house where you lived in Kilmarnock still there?
it's still there, but it's no longer a parsonage. Somebody owns it.
So when you all were living in these different places, you were living on church ground?
We were living in church property in King and Queen and in Kilmarnock. I don't know how many other times my father and mother lived in a parsonage, but probably other places too.
So they didn't really own any property?
They didn't own any property, no. In fact, in Kilmarnock, there are now 3 houses that we lived in, because after my father left the ministry in 1930, we had to move out of the parsonage, so we moved about 2 blocks to another house, and we lived there for a few months, and then we moved again, and then finally in 1933, my father bought some land just outside of Kilmarnock. You came right by it. When you came into Kilmarnock and you began to see businesses and all that sort of thing, that's about where our land was, right at the upper part of that. And he bought 17 acres of land, and part of it was about 7 was farmland, and about 10 was trees, woods, and he had trees cut, and a log cabin, a house that was partly a log cabin, partly just regular, I don't know what you'd call it, but just boards, and I was raised from the time I was about, let's see, it would have been about 13 when we moved up there, raised in a log cabin from then until that time I left Kilmarnock when World War II started. But we had continued to improve it. My mother, even after Daddy died, my mother had extra rooms built, but it was still a pretty rough deal.
Did your dad ever talk about money with you, about how to spend money, how to make money, or?
Well, I remember my dad was thrifty because he had to be thrifty. Although he came from a family where they had a nice farm and they lived pretty well, but they did most of their own work, you know. Going back a long ways, my grandmother, my grandfather's wife, my grandmother Fitz, her father had owned, I think, about 100 slaves, although it was not a plantation area. But he owned a number of farms, and so he had very many people who were slaves. Of course, they did the heavy work, but we really didn't see, I didn't grow up around any, I see very few, knew hardly no black people when I lived in the mountains there, because there just weren't many black people there. They had migrated to other parts of the country, I guess.
But when you came here?
When I came here, of course, there was a lot of black people, but they were segregated. The schools were segregated at that time. But we had black people. I had 2 black fellows who worked for me that I really loved. They were wonderful people, not educated, but they helped us get through the Depression. We all got through the Depression together. It was a very tough time for us.
When the Great Depression hit in 1929, did your father lose anything?
Yeah, well, I think he did. See, he had gone into this coal business, and he had sold a lot of coal, and of course in those days everybody had plenty of money, but a lot of people were putting in furnaces and that sort of thing.
Where was he getting this coal from?
Well,
this area?
he would have it shipped in by boat and rail and boat. I don't know exactly where it came from. Some of it came from Pennsylvania because it was hard coal, and some of it came from Southwest Virginia.
So his job...
But his basic job was taking care of 3 churches. But he was such an energetic fellow, and he knew he had a growing family, and he needed more money than the church field was paying. So he formed a side business and worked at that. And I think when the Depression came, he lost money because he couldn't collect for a lot of the coal.
So he was sort of like a coal retailer.
Well, he retailed, yeah. He collected the coal and he delivered it, and he sold it and of course collected for it and had his profit motive in there. But exactly the details of that I don't know because I was too young. See, at the time this happened, I was only 10 years old.
Were you helping him in any way?
I helped him as a boy. I used to go with him when he would deliver small amounts of coal. At one time he had a little pickup truck that would hold about a half of, which was based on a Model T Ford chassis. It was a Roadster probably one time, but they had a little body built for it. We would go and deliver small quantities of coal, a half a ton or so, in this little thing, and I would go with him. And I remember helping him a few times with that. And then, like all boys, we worked in the garden, weeding the. He was a great gardener. He loved to garden. My father did, and he was a hard-working man, and he was a very good man, and he was a very intelligent man. And when he had a funeral, when he died, even though he hadn't been in the ministry for several years, it was one of the biggest funerals around.
He was well liked.
He was very well loved, and he had done good things for the churches when he had been in the ministry.
Did he ever mention why he chose to get out of the ministry?
No, but that's something I don't really know, except that he had been in the Navy as a young man and probably had it formed a taste for some things like maybe alcohol, and I think finally, after many decades of resisting, when all these troubles came along, I think he gave in a little bit, and so then he resigned the ministry in 1930.
When he was in the Navy, was this before the First War?
Oh yes, this was back in the 1909 or something like that.
I see.
See, he was born in 1884, so he was a young man then, and he was in the Navy. Well, that would make him 16, and he was in his early 20s, sometime in close to between 1905 and 1910. I don't know the exact years.
Did he ever talk about where he went when he was?
Well, he didn't go very far because I think his family, after being in a couple of years, he was mostly around Norfolk and aboard ship and things in Norfolk, out of the Atlantic Fleet somewhere, I guess. But I don't know what ships or anything like that because I was not old enough before he died to talk to him about it, and I just knew he'd been in the Navy. I have some pictures of him, 2 or 3 pictures when he was in the Navy.
He died in 1934.
1933.
1933.
Yeah,
That's during the depths of the Great Depression.
yes, and at that time he was still selling some coal, but he also had gone into the hauling business, and the last steamboat company, which tried to service some part of the Northern Neck, was formed in 1933, and he got the job as delivering as wharf agent, delivering the freight that was landed at Kilmarnock Wharf, which is a wharf about a mile or so from the town of Kilmarnock. And this boat would come in 3 times a week from Baltimore. It was called the Potomac River Line. It was owned by a Lewis family over in Northumberland County. But they serviced a couple of counties in Tidewater, Virginia, and Kilmarnock Wharf was one of the places. And Daddy's job was as freight agent, delivering all the freight that came in to whoever it was consigned to, and also picking up whatever produce and so forth the local farmers wanted to send to Baltimore to market. Some people would send crates of eggs, other people would send chickens and turkeys in the turkey season in the fall, and sometimes calves, and occasionally pigs, but not very often. Kind of hard to transport big hogs, but we used to pick up all sorts of things. And I got into working on that truck when I was about 13, and I was driving the truck around. Delivering freight before I had a driver's license.
Without your father nearby? Just
Well,
doing it
no,
yourself?
just myself, yeah. Once in a while, not all the time, because see, I was still in high school. I finished high school in 1936, but in the summers and whenever possible, I was working with whatever I could do to help.
Tell me about your schooling.
Well, I went to all except the first grade. I went to Kilmarnock High School. At that time, there was a state high school. When I started high school, the high school portion of it, the state had withdrawn funds, and the building was there, and the elementary school was there, but the state no longer paid the teacher's salary for the high school. This occurred for about 4 years, but the state allowed the town people to hire teachers and run the high school portion of it on a tuition basis. So for about 4 years in the 1930s, Kilmarnock High School had you might say, a private high school.
Because there was no money
Because
to
there was
come?
not enough money that came from the state to support the high school. The elementary school was supported, and at that time we only had 7 grades. But that's when I went to school. The first 2 years it was a private school, and then the last 2 years the state began to support it again.
Your father died in 1933. and
1933.
You were about 14 years old?
I was 14 years old when he died, yes.
Was there a, I don't want to say replacement, father figure?
Oh, no,
took
nobody.
Nobody.
My mother raised us for the rest of the time, and she did a very good job, I think.
At school, was there any teachers that stick out in your mind as being important to you?
Well, yeah, I admired the first principal that we had. His name was Eugene Hall, and he was a middle-aged man who had been involved in education somewhere else before he came to Kilmarnock. But he was a great historian, and I really, he imparted in me a love for history, for reading history, and trying to learn as much as you can about history. So I thought he was a great role model. And when I was going to school as a young boy, I thought then the thing that I'd really like to do more than anything else was to be a teacher of history in some college. I never got there. Fate intervened. But
As a 14-year-old boy who doesn't have a father anymore, it must have been a real struggle. Did you have emotional problems that you had to deal with?
well, the biggest emotional problem I had before he died was the period of time prior to his death, because he had some rough years, and well, he had a fondness for drink, and this was a great source of sorrow to my mother. So we had a really emotional problem with him.
But after he passed on...
After he passed on, then of course we no longer had a father figure. And there was nobody really who substituted, not any one person.
How about your older brothers? Some
Well, my older brother was only 2.5 years older than I was. He was different. He was a very intelligent fellow, and when he was 16, he was writing poetry. He was a good.
What was his name?
His name was Newton Gibson, and he eventually became a writer, but he took the hard way to do it. He spent a lot of time. He was actually a 17-year-old Marine when my father died, and because he was the oldest person in the family who could work, we were able to get him out of the Marine Corps in a few months, 3 or 4 months. And he got a hardship discharge and came home and began to operate the freight business, delivering freight for the steamboat company. And that was our primary source of income during the Depression. It wasn't very much, but it kept the family together. There was no welfare or anything like that. In those days, if the family was totally destitute and no relatives to take over the children, well, they used to have a poorhouse in many places. I don't think they did in Lancaster County. I don't know what they did here. But we never had any connection with any government help of any kind. We made it through the Depression, and every one of us had, I think, good careers. This older brother he went back in the Marine Corps after having come back out to help support the family during our early years, when the 2 younger children were too young to work. We didn't want to leave school. We wanted to finish high school, and we did. All finished high school, and the youngest one finished Virginia Tech with Mrs. DuPont's help.
What do you mean with DuPont's help?
Well, Mrs. DuPont was a lady who grew up in a little community near Kilmarnock. And she became a secretary to one of the DuPont men in Wilmington, I guess. And when his wife died a few years later, she was married to this DuPont. And because this was a very wealthy family, she set up scholarships around to help needy boys and girls who wanted to go to college from this area. So he applied, and my younger brother was an he's valedictorian of his class when he was in high school. And he applied for help from Ms. DuPont, and she helped him over the years that he went to VPI. He went as a military student and graduated as an electrical engineer at age 20 in 1942, went immediately into the service as a second lieutenant.
Did she go to church before that time in your dad's churches?
No. She didn't live here.
I see.
She came from this area, and she had relatives here, but she never lived here as an adult. She had She owned a real nice old colonial house about 10 to 15 miles from here, which she would occasionally visit in the summertime, come down the yacht.
But it's not like you knew her.
No, I didn't know her ever. I never knew Miss DuPont. But my younger brother, I think, repaid her for her help to him, because he's a fine man too. He's an outstanding liberal Democrat. I'm a conservative Republican. We had some interesting conversations, but he's a green person too. You know, he's very much interested in all sorts of good causes like that, and he has been for many years.
Tell me a little bit about politics in the 1930s that you can remember. Would you consider your family in the 30s now to be politically motivated in any way?
Well, my father was interested in politics. He was a Republican. The people in the area of the state that he came from were pretty well split between Republican and Democrat in those days. Right now, I'd say it's more Democratic than it is Republican. But he was interested in politics, and my mother was always deeply interested in politics, and a lifelong Republican.
Was she a voter too?
Oh yes, voted, and she's a great reader, and when he was in the ministry, she was active in church work, was a missionary union and teaching Sunday schools and all that sort of thing. After he left the ministry, she no longer had that connection, so she didn't do those things. But she remained a lifelong devotee of reading books and magazines and so
In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt runs for president.
Yes.
And against Hoover.
Yeah.
Did your father and mother talk about that election?
Well, if they talked about it, I didn't remember it. I was a little too young I wasn't in politics at that age. See, in 1932, I just became 13 in the fall of that year.
By 1936, the country had gone on the downswing and the upswing, the downswing. As a historian, I've been told that either you loved Roosevelt or you hated him with a passion.
Well, due to the influence of my mother, we were not big Roosevelt fans. But, I recognize him as a great leader in the years of the Depression, and although he didn't really get us out of the Depression, the war got us out of the Depression. When war work started and we began to do defense work and began to build up we became the arsenal of democracy, that began to help, and then things really got a lot better. I never made any real money. The highest salary I ever received when I was working after we quit the freight delivery business, which we did about 1940. The highest salary I ever received was $18 a week.
What was your first job?
Well, the first job I had I worked a little bit for people thinning corn and things like that, when I was just 12 or 13 years old. But the first job that I had where I was regularly employed was when I was a junior, starting my junior year of high school, or a little before that. I began to work for a store in town that sold young men's clothes. It was a men's clothing store. This business eventually failed in the Depression, but I worked there during the summer, full time, 6 days a week. And when school started, I went down and opened that store, built a fire sometime around 8 o'clock or so. Built a fire in the wintertime in the stove. It was heated with some kind of a stove. And then when noon came, I was only a block away. The school was only a block or so away from downtown. I would walk over and stay in the store on my lunch hour while he went home to his wife and had lunch. Then when he would come back, I'd go back to school in the afternoon. And at 3 o'clock, when school let out, I'd be back in the store again, working with him until the store closed, maybe about 8 or 9 o'clock.
Primarily, what was your duty?
As clerk, waiting on trade, and he taught me some things that most men never learn. I learned how to sew with a treadle sewing machine, and I did that so I could cut off trousers and put cuff trousers. and make minor alterations to garments. And I did a little bit of that. Never became what you'd call a seamstress or seamster, but I did learn to operate a sewing machine.
You were still in high school?
I was still in high school, and I continued to work there until I got out of high school, and then I got a different job. I got a job working in a drugstore in the fall of the year after I got out of high school. Regular salary was $35 a month. Paid once a month, but one good thing about this job was I only worked 5 days a week. Of course, usually the drugstore was open until about 10, 11 o'clock at night, especially on weekends, 12 o'clock at night. Nobody worked 40-hour weeks around here. There was never any union or anything. Everybody worked 6 days a week most of the time, but this fellow, the pharmacist liked to give people 5 days a week and a day off. And so I worked there for a year or so, and then I began to work. I worked for different, after we left the freight business, I worked for a fellow who sold a store, wholesale. He sold candy and cigarettes and all that sort of thing, and bulk groceries to smaller retailers. He was a jobber sort of for wholesale groceries and wholesale cigarettes and candies and that sort of thing.
These jobs you had, was there any time when you lost a job because they went broke?
Well, I guess you might say I don't remember exactly when that clothing store went broke, but it was around that time that he simply couldn't make it. He sold only men's clothing, and he had done credit business, and he had accounts that were uncollectible and that sort of thing.
All during this time, you were still living at home?
Yes, lived in a log cabin.
Did it ever cross your mind that maybe you should join one of the government jobs?
There were no government jobs that I knew anything about.
The CCC or the WPA?
No, well, I couldn't leave home because I couldn't leave mother. I stayed home longer than any of the other three. The oldest boy went back in the Marine Corps when he was 19, and he went to China and before World War II, and he came back and got out of the Marine Corps and tried to become a writer. His wife he got married to a lady who was a real nice, efficient nurse. She was an RN, and she was helping support him for a few months. But then that was in 1941 when he came back from China. And
so during the late 30s, it was your money that was supporting.
My money supported the family for the years that my younger brother was in college, and after this older brother left. When I was 17 when I took over the support of the family, running the freight business.
As a young man like that, did you come home and say, "Here, Mom, here's the money"?
Mother received the money was mailed to us, and she handled all the money. I took a personal salary of 50 cents a day for just spending money,
Right.
and $3 a week. But the rest of the money was all the family money, and that's the way it was. And whenever I began to work for other people, the money went into the family account.
But she's the one who spent the money
She
for
spent
whatever
the money.
needed.
Yeah. She was very good at stretching money. Had to be, because we didn't have a whole lot of it all during those years. I never made any good weekly salary until just prior to World War II, they began to start defense industry classes. And in the local high school, a few miles from Kilmarnock, there was a class set up in metalworking and welding and that sort of thing in a local high school to prepare people to take jobs in defense industries where we were rapidly trying to build up the armed forces and the capacity to to fight the war, and to help in the beginning to help the British survived before.
Did you go to those classes?
I was going to one of those classes in the fall of 1941, and as soon as Pearl Harbor came along, I left Kilmarnock and went to Baltimore and applied for a job with a shipbuilding company, Bethlehem Fairfield Shipbuilding. And they hired me as an apprentice welder. This was the second day of January 1942. Before we'd been at war for a month. And I lived in, I worked in Baltimore then until I enlisted in the Marines. I had to work because the previous year I had bought my only new car up to that time. It cost something like $880. It was a new Plymouth. And I had gone in hock for it. Was paying for it over a period of time. So I went to work in Baltimore. I was making unheard of salary of $50, $60, $70, $80 a week, depending on how much overtime there was. So I could quickly save up enough money, and as soon as I could pay off this indebtedness to the car, then I enlisted in the Marines.
So you had a new car.
I had a new car for about a year before the war, but and I was making $18 a week.
Did you retain that car even while you were off to the sea?
No. After the war came up, I paid it off, the indebtedness, and then I sold it.
The United States draft occurred in 1940. You're prime age, prime shape.
But in order to be required to register for the draft, you had to be 21 years of age, and I was not. I was still 20 years of age the last day before the draft started. They started drafting people, but I didn't have to register because I was still 20. One day prior to, I missed it by one day. But the draft never affected me because I enlisted in the Marine Corps and I had a hard time getting in. I couldn't get it. The Marines wouldn't let me in until I changed my draft qualification. Eventually I had to register, of course, later on, but when the war started. But I'd been declared 3A for two reasons. One thing is my mother was totally dependent on my earnings to support the family, and the other reason was I was in the defense industry. I was welding in the shipyard.
So you could have been deferred.
I could have been deferred. Yeah, I was deferred, but I had to. I went to the draft board and told them I wanted to get in the Marines, and would they give me a 1A classification? They argued with me a little bit, and then they changed it, and then I went into the Marine Corps, enlisted recruiting office again, and joined the Marine.
Tell me about what you understood about world events in the late 30s.
Well, I followed world events avidly. I remember when the Germans invaded Poland. It just happened that night when. That same day when that happened, and I was on a date, and I was listening to the car radio, and when I heard that the Germans had invaded Poland, I said, "Oh my goodness, we're going to have a great big war," because I knew it would happen because I knew about the alliances between England and France to help Poles, and so all this war began to fall into place real quickly there, and I was not. We always take newspapers. One of the jobs I had as a boy was delivering the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and we also delivered the Richmond News Leader. We delivered all the papers in Kilmarnock back in the time when we were just kids, my brothers and I. So we belonged to a family where they talked about the things that were going on in the world, mother and father.
How much did you know in the 30s, before the war, about Hitler and his racial Jewish problem?
Didn't know about that very much. I don't think a lot of people didn't know about that. But we knew that Hitler was a kind of a dangerous person because how quickly he rearmed. As soon as he took over in Germany, they immediately began to rearm openly.
What did you hear about Mussolini or the Japs?
Well, we didn't hear much about the Japanese. We didn't know about the Japanese. I guess we knew they were they were, well, the worst thing we knew was we found out how bad they were to the people that they subjugated. Because my brother, see, was stationed in the 4th Regiment Shanghai for 2 years during the late 30s. And so he saw what they did, to how they treated the Chinese people and how they abused the Chinese people.
Did he write home?
He knew, yeah, he wrote home, and he knew how bad so we had that opinion of them, that they were almost less than human in their treatment of subject persons, like the Chinese at Nanking and so forth. Yeah, we knew about that.
But Mussolini didn't really play a big part.
Mussolini was kind of a joke. I mean, he tried to be a big militaristic guy, but the Italians are not a militaristic people. They didn't. A lot of them were not greatly devoted to him.
And this was evident in the late 1930s to you?
Yeah, to me it was, that he was not a serious threat. Hitler was, and he became, and you can see it as he began to against Czechoslovakia, and when they took over Austria and all, you could see what his goal was.
But that Poland thing really struck you.
Well, I knew the war had started. I mean, that was when the war started. They invaded.
As 1940 went through, and beginning of 1941, Britain was being attacked.
Yeah.
People were calling for volunteers to even join the British.
Yeah.
Did that ever go through your mind?
No, I couldn't do any of that stuff. I still was supporting my mother. I was still supporting my mother.
Where were you when you heard the news of Pearl?
I was playing football and playing 6-man football. I was an assistant scoutmaster in the local, when we formed a scout troop here. I became one of the assistant scoutmasters. I'd never been a scout because we didn't have scouts until then. And we formed a 6-man football team, the Boy Scouts did. And the only people we played were the local high school teams. The boys, we had boys who were in the scouts who were pretty good sized high school kids, 16 years old, up to 16, 17 years old. And we had several assistant scoutmasters who were adult. I mean, I was about 20 years old. And when we started this troop. And so we decided we wanted to form our own team. And on Sundays we'd scrimmage a little bit. So on that Sunday, on Pearl Harbor Sunday, we were out scrimmaging in the local field across the road from where one of the boys lives. And then I heard about that, and I said, "Boy, we're in it now."
Did somebody come running across the
Well,
field?
we heard it over the radio. I don't remember exactly how I knew it, but we knew it right away.
You went to Baltimore to get that job soon
Yeah.
after Pearl Harbor Day.
January the 2nd, I left home and never lived at home from that time on.
Did you want to join up the Marines right at Pearl
Well,
Harbor?
I knew I couldn't because I had this indebtedness hanging over me, and I knew I had to support my mother. But when my younger brother finished college in June of '42, then he began to earn his pay as a second lieutenant, and he could get a Class A allotment to help my mother. And then when I got in the Marine Corps, I could do the same thing. So she was able to get along on our help during the war.
Why did you not decide to go to college in the late 30s?
I couldn't go to college. I didn't have any source. I didn't see how I could go to college when I was a sole source of income to the family. I was the only one making any money after my older brother went back to the Marines, and they didn't have defense allotments for Marines in those days. And he was only making about $30 a month.
You hadn't considered getting married yourself?
No, I was, I had girlfriends and things, but no, I didn't. I got engaged to my first wife in the spring of '42 while I was working in Baltimore.
Is that where you met her?
No, she was a local girl here. I knew her before, but we got engaged, and then I actually got married during the war. I came home on a furlough from California in April of '44. And a 15-day furlough. It took 10 days for travel, 5 days each way on train. And we got married on Easter of 1944.
In Baltimore, when you were working up there as a welder, how difficult was the work?
Well, it wasn't. It was difficult to be a good welder, and it was very uncomfortable sometimes, because sometimes you were trying to weld a seam right under a deck, and the sun was beating down on the metal over your head, and it would get real hot, and hot metal would flow down your. You had leather sleeves on and leather gloves, but sometimes molten metal would get in your glove and burn your. I used to have burns on my arms, and I had a cable burning too one time next to my arm, and I had a funny place where extra hair was growing for a long time after that place. It was but people got killed in the shipyard every once in a while. They would fall, or something would fall on them, or they would fall off of scaffolds and things.
Did you ever see any of these accidents?
I never saw a fatal accident, but we were kept busy with people getting burns and bruises and that kind of thing.
Do you recall any of the hulls that you made?
Well, we were making Liberty ships. This was the shipyard that made the first Liberty ship, and we were making Liberty ships, and we got better at it all the time, I think. But I was not interested in staying at that. I could have stayed in that for a long time, I'm sure. But I didn't really like to be a welder too much. I didn't think I had this natural talent to be a good welder. I didn't run as good as seams as maybe some of the people did. And a lot of times you had to weld in places where you were breathing pretty bad air. And so I didn't think I wanted to do that. So I got out of that, and I enlisted. I wanted from the beginning to be in the war.
Why the Marines?
I don't know. Well, there's a local, my brother had a classmate. He graduated from high school in 1933. And he had a classmate who served an enlistment in the Marines in peacetime from 33 to 37. And I admired him. I thought he was a good-looking guy in his outfit. And I read books about Marines, and I always wanted to be a Marine. And my older brother went in at 17, and then he went back in again at 19. He ended up eventually serving about over 20 years. And his highest rank was commissioned warrant officer. And during the Korean War, he was in charge of all news in the Armed Forces radio in Tokyo at MacArthur's headquarters. He was the head of the news, running the Army's papers and broadcasts and that sort of thing.
Was the propaganda of the Marines better than the Army's or Navy?
Well, I suppose it was. You got to admit they have pretty good PR people. If you look at television now, you see
today, yeah, but how about back in 1930s and 40s?
Well, we didn't have propaganda much then. It wasn't so much. It's just what I wanted to be. I thought they had exciting. You had a chance to maybe serve on a battleship and go all over the world and that sort of thing. Well, that was in peacetime. I knew it wouldn't be like that in wartime. I would like to have been a seagoing Marine, but you had to be selected for that. And I was selected to be a radio person for some reason or other. And from that I became a parachutist and so forth.
Tell me about where you went to enlist. You mentioned going to the draft board. Was it in Kilmarnock?
The draft board's in Lancaster. Lancaster is the county seat of Lancaster County. And I just went up there and told them I had to be 1A if I was going to get in where I wanted to be in. I didn't want to be in the Army. I didn't want to be in the Navy. I wanted to be a Marine.
The draft board members, did you actually know any of them personally?
I don't remember too much about that. I just remember petitioning them to change it, and they agreed, and finally did, and then I could enlist, and I did.
Where did you go to enlist?
I enlisted in Baltimore.
Did you know anybody who went with you to enlist?
No, I didn't know anybody else. I went down on my own and enlisted and expected to go in right away. this was during the period of time that the Marines were fighting on Guadalcanal and having a rough time of it. And I knew I wouldn't get in that, but I knew I wanted to get started at something. And so by the time I actually got in and the Marines were ready to take me, it was October the 1st. So I started boot camp, and by reporting to Baltimore and riding a train all night down to Parris Island, to Beaufort, South Carolina, and reporting for duty on the 1st of October 1942. And I stayed in Parris Island until only for about a month, and then I went to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, to fire for record as with a rifle. Marines attach a great deal of importance to rifle, to marksmanship, and I spent 3 weeks learning to be a good rifle expert. In fact, I was an expert rifleman and fired a high score in my platoon on record day, which made me an extra $5 a month all the time I was in the Marine Corps.
You got paid for those?
I got paid for being an expert rifleman. Yeah.
I'm gonna pause. Take.
In about a year, and then he was the first sergeant all during the war, and we got together when I was in Camp Pendleton. One day when he was going overseas with a replacement draft, we got together and spent a day together in San Diego. And then he went over, and he was over there for a couple of years in the Northern Solomons, and he also was on Guam. He got a couple of battle stars, and he came out of the Marine Corps after the war, and was with the state troopers for a year, and then he decided he wanted to go back to Marines again. So back again, he went in and stayed in for 20 years. And the first thing they did is send him to the Naval School of Journalism. Well, that was what he applied for and got it, and he did very well at it. And so from that time on, he was a writer. He wrote for all sorts of Marine Corps magazines and news stories, and published for the various generals and people that he worked with. And as I said, he was in charge of the Armed Forces Radio Newsroom in Tokyo all during the Korean War.
Tell me about life as a new recruit on Parris Island for you.
Well, the first place, they scare you to death because they're rougher than the cob. I mean, they're really tough.
Can you describe your first memory there?
Well, the first thing you remember is getting off of the trains and trying to get on the trucks that they came. We rode by train from Baltimore. We started out from Baltimore, but we also had a bunch of people on the train from upstate New York, and then another bunch of people. About a third of us were from Maryland, a third of us were from upstate New York, and another third came from West Virginia. And that was what my recruit platoon consisted of. About 3 different groups of people from these different parts of the country. And as soon as we got down, we rode down at nighttime on this train. It got into what the heck is the name of that town down there?
Beaufort.
Beaufort, yeah. And these trucks came out to meet us, and boy, how rough these guys were, getting us lined up and shaped up to get in the truck, and calling us everything but decent, you know, all sorts of profanity right and left, and then we rode out to the barracks, and then you began to go through a day or two of drawing clothes and all that sort of thing, learning what was expected of you, learning how to march. First thing they teach you down there is how to march. You have to learn how to march, and I had the misfortune of being just at the right height to be tall enough to be what they call a platoon guide. I was the fellow on the right when we were marching in a line, and I had to always stay in a straight line. If I began to wander, I caught hell, you know, because I was guiding the whole platoon, the guy on the right. I was a squad leader, you might say, of the third rank, first rank, second rank, third rank. The line up about 20 this way, you know, and about 3 rank. And here I am over here on the third one, and when we did right face and start off in that direction, well, I'm the fellow who was supposed to market or guide the whole outfit in a straight line. So I was blessed out by the drill instructors. We had several drill instructors. We had about 3 drill instructors. And they were different types. Some of them were pretty genial fellows. They were mostly corporals at that time. Now they're much higher rank. But in those days, most of them were corporals, once in a while a sergeant. But they didn't have many high-ranking NCOs in the Marine Corps at that time.
Did you make any friends?
Oh, yes, I made friends, and I made a good friend who was a few people in Baltimore. I met a few people from Baltimore, 2 or 3 of them, and we were together for all of our boot camp days, and I went back to that fella. But they went into, when I went into radio school, and then when I got out of radio school and went into the paratroops, then these fellows were all in the 4th Division. They had all been in whatever military specialty they had. They were put into some part of the 4th Division, which was forming at the time I went through boot camp, and they went on overseas and participated in the invasion of the Marshall Islands and also invading Tinian and Saipan. So they were already in 2 battles before Iwo Jima, and then they were one of the assault divisions on Iwo Jima.
Did you volunteer to go into radio school or what?
No. That's a result of a day that we spent. Excuse me. We were in boot camp. One day we spent taking tests, all sorts of written tests, and one test that we took was what's called the like sounds test. It's where you are sitting there and you're listening and you're writing, and you're supposed to tell on the sheet that you're recording answers, you're supposed to tell them when sounds sounded alike and when they sounded unlike. And they were playing coded words, on a recorder or something, and you could hear these sounds, and you're supposed to write down where these sounds were like or unlike. And I think because of my just guessing a certain way on some of those things, and because we learned to copy code by sound, dots and dashes, and that was what it was all about, is to pick people to learn to operate radios that were the broadcasts. A lot of them were encoded. Most of them were, as a matter of fact. If you were on a network that could take code,
When you were doing that test, did you have any clue that's what they were doing?
I didn't have any idea what it was. I was just doing what they told me, and I had no idea why I was doing it. I knew it had something to do with radio sounds, but I didn't have any idea. I don't think I was particularly good at code, but I did learn code and could copy about 20 words a minute or so, because I was not trained to be a high-speed operator. The high-speed operators would sit at typewriters and type things. I never did type that way. I had to print everything out on a message center pad. But on Iwo Jima, when we had a setup one time where we had a telegram. We had a little telegraph setup where the sound would come in over into our earphones in the form of 5-letter code groups. And one day I took the operational order from the division to the regimental commander, and it was all in 5-letter code groups. And I was there in the dark with just a flashlight and trying to hide it under a poncho so that the Japanese wouldn't see me in there, And I had to copy page after page of these 5-letter code groups, and I was pretty rusty by that time.
And they didn't make any sense to you?
Well, I didn't know that 5-letter code group doesn't make any sense at all. It's just a bunch of jumble of letters. And then I had to send that to the message center where they would decode it and get what was actually being said. There was no open communication. Not like orders. Orders had to be encrypted.
Where did you go for the radio schooling?
Radio was at Camp Lejeune. It was at Hadnut Point, Camp Lejeune, and we had nice brick barracks. But every day we would put our dungarees on and we'd go out, and our instructors seemed to think that we had to learn how to walk through swamps. So we would go down to the swamps and wait around for a good while, and then we'd find a place dry enough to set up a radio and try to communicate back and forth with a voice radio or something like that. It was and part of the morning was spent. A lot of the morning was spent. Some days, not a lot of days, in sitting in and listening to code and trying to learn to copy code.
How was the food down at Paris Island and
Well,
Camp Lejeune?
Well, it was all right as far as I can remember. And I didn't have any problem with food. In fact, I thought some things were pretty good. I learned to like the famous SOS stuff, you know. I thought that was great. I never had trouble with food. The only time I got a little bit hungry when we went to Japan for occupation duty after the war, we ate a lot of sea rations, and sea rations get a little boring after a while, especially the kind we had during the war.
How long did your radio training last at Camp Lejeune?
It was about I think maybe 3 months. It started in late '42 and ended. I would guess it's between 2 and 3 months. I don't remember exactly, but I think it's pretty close to 3 months.
Where did they send you after your radio school?
Well, I didn't go anywhere but just over to parachute school, because at the end of the radio school, as I may have mentioned, the paratroops allowed 2 members of each radio class to come to the paratroops. We didn't know it. We thought we were getting out of being radio men, because we weren't crazy about that radio stuff. We thought we'd get to be regular paratroopers, you know, but all they were doing is trying to pick people to set up their own communications within the parachute battalions, and we had to go through parachute training in order to do it. So we had about 12 people from this radio class who volunteered for the paratroops, and 2 people were selected. One fellow from New York named Shanahan and me. And we went over to, we walked from one place to another, from the radio school to the parachute school. And I remember a funny thing about going to parachute school is I went over there to join up. I noticed a bunch of fellows sitting out on a bench, and I looked at them carefully, and I saw that every one of them had a cast on his leg. And that meant that he had been hurt some way. And that was my introduction to parachute school, seeing all those fellows sitting around with broken legs. And we did have people who were banged up jumping from parachutes.
How about you?
Yeah, and I saw a fellow get killed when I was doing my jumping to qualify for wings. I had just jumped, and I was picking up my parachute and stuffing it in a bag to get ready to go back to the collection point, when I heard people hollering, open your TC, open your training chest, open your TC, open your TC. I looked up, and here was a guy coming down, and his main parachute was just like this, you know, all wrapped up, and it didn't inflate. And they were hollering at him, of course he couldn't hear them, but hollering at him to open his chest chute. You always had another chute on your chest that you could open. A little bit smaller, but it would take you down all right. And they were hollering at him to open his chest chute, but he was making his first jump, and he never did anything. He just hit the ground. He hit the ground some little distance away, maybe about 20 yards away from me, and he just bounced up, and that was the end of him. Well, what did they do at the school? They took the parachute off the man, and it was bloody and all. They took it over to the parachute loft, and they dried it out, and they repacked it. And then the senior officer at the school, who happened to be a major that weekend, took it out to the jump field and jumped with it that same day, to show that the parachutes normally work pretty well, you know, which they did. It was all static line jumping, you know. You jumped from a static line, jumped out of a side door of a DC-3, and you had your parachute, a big strap that went into your pack. You hooked onto a static line. You went down to the door and jumped out, and that pulled the parachute open. Pulled the top, broke the things that were holding the parachute, and the parachute was pulled out and pulled that up to the top, and then the line broke that's tied to that business, and then you're supposed to inflate. And it usually worked pretty well. One time though, I was in California. And we were out there at Camp Pendleton, the only jump we made in California. after the battalion formed up out in Camp Pendleton. And my parachute opened, and when it opened, all I could see was white. And what had happened is that as it opened, some lines had wrapped around one of my legs, and I was hanging upside down. And I was headed for the ground head first. So it took me a good while to get my leg unwrapped, and so I didn't enjoy that jump as much as some of the others.
Did you ever have to use the reserve chute?
Never, no, never.
How many times do you suspect you jumped?
I didn't jump many times because we couldn't get airplanes. I only jumped 6 times to get wings and 2 times just on combat training. The most exciting jump I had was when we were doing about a 300-foot jump down in eastern North Carolina, and that was a real low jump. They were telling us, you got to be ready for use your chest chute real quick if it doesn't open, because you didn't have much time. So I knew we were pretty low. I could look out of the window and see trees going by, and they're just not very much lower than we were. It didn't seem to be. They were, of course, but they seemed pretty close. And as soon as we went out of the door, man, I was all ready with my hand on my chest pull, ready to open that thing. But it opened all right, except that it went down in a swamp, and my parachute went over a tree, and I had a heck of a time getting it off the tree. And I landed in water about this deep. And it was kind of exciting, but not as scary as the time when I was headed for the ground head first.
Did you have to pack your own parachutes?
We did in the Marines, yeah. That's what we always packed our own parachutes. Except that jump that I made in California. They were done by riggers because there would be too much trouble to take us into the parachute loft where they were doing the packing.
Were you assigned to a particular company in the paratroopers?
Oh yeah, I was in the headquarters and service company, and I was in the communication platoon, which was a part of that company, and I was in the radio section. I had a staff sergeant who was in charge of us in the radio section. We had probably a couple of dozen guys who were in the communication, maybe more than that. I guess altogether we must have had. I've got a picture in there in my book. I'll show you afterwards. My company, headquarters and service company, which had 200 or 300 people in it, a big company, and the parachute platoon I had a separate picture of that, of the people who were communicators. Not the parachute platoon, but the communicators.
Was the parachute called a parachute regiment?
No, there was a parachute regiment, but that was overseas. That had the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd battalions in that, and they were all overseas. And I don't know where they were stationed. I think it was someplace. They were in New Zealand for a while. They were in New Zealand.
What was yours called?
Well, we were the 4th Parachute Battalion, and we had not gotten overseas. But that was the 1st Parachute Regiment, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And ours was just a separate battalion. We were getting ready to go. We thought we'd be attached to the 4th Division, but we never did go with them. When they went overseas, they went on over. We were kind of behind them in training. They were more thoroughly trained, and we were just getting going as a unit. So I didn't ever get to make a parachute jump, and I always regretted that. But I don't know. I guess probably a good thing I didn't, because mortality is pretty high on some of those parachute jumps that the Army did over in Sicily and in Normandy and later in Germany. Yeah.
How long did you spend in this parachute battalion?
Altogether in training, it was probably 10 months to a year, between 10 months and a year. A little hard for me to remember exactly when we became 5th Division. We became 5th Division toward the end of that thing, and we went from tent camp. We were in tent camp in the paratroops, where we slept in tents. And we were several miles away from the main portion of Camp Pendleton. And when we went into the 5th Division, we moved from that tent camp into a barracks, wooden barracks at Camp Pendleton. And that's where we were until we went overseas. But we had to go through very much the same training with the 5th Division as we did with the parachute battalion. Some of the stuff was repetitive.
Did you stay with the same group that whole almost year in the parachute?
Yeah, I was in the headquarters company of the parachute battalion.
Would you consider yourself, while you were in the Marines, an outgoing type of guy, or more shy, or what?
Well, I was not as outgoing as many people. I was a little bit on the quiet side. I didn't. I was a little surprised to make corporal, and right at the end of my first year in the Corps, I got promoted to corporal, which I think was pretty good. But I tried to be a good Marine. I really did. I don't know what that was, but I tried to be a good Marine. Tried to do what they wanted me to do, and.
Did you smoke?
I smoked cigar. For many years I smoked cigars. I never smoked cigarettes.
How about alcohol while you were in the Corps?
Well, yeah, most everybody drank beer. When we go on Liberty, I never drank booze much, but I used to drink beer. And I drank too much beer sometimes. Before we left the States, I used to go over to the beer joint quite often in the afternoons after we got off duty. And stay over there and drink half a dozen beers, and that was bad. Geez, it's so cheap, 10 cents a bottle or something like that,
When you went on Liberty, before you went overseas, did you go see any shows or dances, or?
Did I see
what?
any, like,
USO?
USOs? Well, not USO shows, but when we were in the paratroops at Camp Pendleton, in the tent camp, we used to train for 11 days, and then we would be off for 3 days, and so buses would come down from L.A. and we'd ride up to L.A. and we'd be in L.A. for 3 days, and then buses would bring us back again. And I used to go out to Hollywood and go to nightclubs, and went to the Palladium one time. I heard a lot of big bands play at the Palladium, and went to some nightclubs out there.
Did you keep writing your fiance back here at home?
Oh yeah. And I had been married, and then while I was going through this 5th Division training, I got the leave and went home and got married.
What date did you get married?
I got married on April 6, 1944.
And that was on a trip back here to
Yeah, I had a 15-day leave, and it's the first real leave I'd ever had.
That must have been a journey by itself.
Well, I got on a train, I think, at Los Angeles, and rode for 5 days on a day coach, By the time I got to Baltimore, I'd worn out, I'll tell you. And then it took the same length of time to get back from Baltimore back. So 2/3 of my leave was spent riding the train, and 1/3 getting married and having a little short honeymoon. But that was the way it was.
Did your wife get pregnant on that honeymoon?
No, we didn't have any children until we'd been married about 7 years. I have 3 children now. I lost my oldest daughter last December. She was a wonderful girl who became a classical violinist and spent most of her working life in the New York City area. And she contracted, while she was in college, she contracted lupus, which is what the basic thing that killed my first wife was lupus. And this daughter of mine had lupus in college, but she persevered and went through East Carolina University and majored in violin. Then she went to Iceland and played in the Icelandic Symphony for a year, and then she came back to New York and went to the Conservatory of Music and got her master's. And she then performed in the New York City area with a number of symphonies and Broadway shows.
What was her name?
Her name was Newton Gibson.
How about your other 2 children?
My other 2 children are boys. One of them is a respiratory therapist at the Centera Hospital in Norfolk. He's been with respiratory work for over 20 years.
What's his name?
His name is Jeffrey Allen Gibson. And then I have a boy who works for a company that arranges transportation for various industries, shipping and all that. So he's sort of a shipping fellow. He runs an office in Richmond.
What's his name?
His name is Junior, Robert Newton Gibson Jr.
Tell me about your first wife.
My first wife was talented musically, and she played and taught music. That's her organ over there, and she had a lot of talent. She could play almost any instrument if she had a little time on it. She started out as a little girl playing accordion and piano. Took piano lessons. She took voice lessons.
What was her name?
Her name was Ione George, and she was born right across the field here. This property came to me, it came to us, through her family.
What attracted you to her?
Oh, I think her ability to play the accordion. I always wanted to play an accordion. I never could. I don't have a nickel's worth of talent for keyboard instruments, but I like to hear them. So she played really well, and so I heard her sing and play, and that sort of got me involved with her, and we.
In 1944, the division starting to start formulating going overseas, and you get a 15-day half-month pass to come way back here to get married.
Yeah.
You.
I didn't think we were going to get married, but she said we're going to get married, so she prevailed, and we did. But she was working in Baltimore. It's the same place where I worked, but she was working in the office, and I was working out on the boat in the ships, but not at the same time. We didn't work at the same time there. She came after I did, after I left in the Marines.
You went back to Camp Pendleton after that half-month visit, and now you're a married man and going into battle.
Yeah. I wasn't back very long until we did leave. You see, my regiment left the division earlier than the division went overseas. The 5th, we were out on maneuvers, making practice landings out on San Clemente Island, when all of a sudden the 26th Marines was ordered to go back and combat load and ship out. So we came back to our base camp and loaded for combat, and shipped out and headed for, we didn't know where we were going, but we left San Diego. And we found out later that where we were headed was Guam, because the 3rd Division was retaking Guam for the United States at that time. And they were having a little trouble. So they wanted some reinforcements. So our regiment was called up to go out there and reinforce them. But they decided by the time we got out to the Hawaiian Islands that it was not necessary, that they didn't have to have us out there. They had the situation under control. So we put into Hilo and went to a camp which had been built by the 2nd Marine Division after they came back from Tarawa, where they'd been shot up pretty badly in a 3-day invasion of Tarawa.
Yeah.
So they came back and they had a camp built there. They called Camp Tarawa, and that's where we went. We went to Camp Tarawa in the 5th Division. That was our base camp overseas. Was this on the Big Island of Hawaii, on the Parker Ranch, on the lee side of
How long did you stay at?
Well, we stayed there we went over there in about July of 44 until New Year's Day. We began to load for Iwo Jima, and loaded ship for Iwo Jima. And we went from Hilo to Pearl Harbor and stayed a little while, a week or so. And then we went to Maui and made a practice landing over there on Maui. And then we came back to Pearl and shipped out from I don't know exactly what day, but by this time it had been about a couple of weeks had passed by, maybe a little more. And we shipped out headed for Iwo Jima, which we didn't know we were even going to until we actually had been a day or so in the convoy going out there. And then they came out with their maps and overlays and all that kind of stuff. And we began to learn a whole bunch of call signs, new call signs for radio call signs to identify the various regiments and companies and battalions and that sort of thing.
Your ship you were going over on, do you recall the name?
Yeah, the ship I went out on was the APA 121, USS Hocking, Hocking. It was an attack transport, a new attack transport, which means it was built to haul troops to invade a shore, someplace.
But it was big.
It was big, yeah. It's big. It wasn't an LST or anything like that. It was a regular ship.
Yeah. As you were on those ships and they told you where you were going, they said Iwo Jima. Had you ever heard that before?
Never heard of it. Never heard of it. No, we didn't know anything about it at all. But the way they told us about it, they said it was pretty heavily fortified, but they didn't think it would take too long to take it because it's going to be so heavily bombarded before the operation. And it was bombed for maybe 2 months before we before we landed, and then immediately before it was heavily bombarded with battleships and all kinds of repeated attacks by dive bombers and that sort of thing. They just blasted the heck out of that place. But we found out we didn't kill many people. I saw 2 dead Japanese when the afternoon of D-Day when I landed in a little observation post there. I walked by. Other than that, I hardly ever saw a dead Japanese. Once in a while, you'd see them where they'd blown themselves up or something like that, But a lot of them were killed in caves and underground because although there's like 21,000 people or more there, they were all underground. You hardly ever saw them.
When you first set eyes on Mount Suribachi and the island, what did it look like to you?
Well, it was all smoke and planes bombing it, and artillery shelling it, and we had some artillery. The big guns when we were riding around in landing craft, getting ready to go ashore. This is on D-Day. We get pretty close to a battleship, and they would be shooting those 16-inch guns, and it might shake you out of the water. It was noisy, and there were thousands of men and I guess hundreds and hundreds of landing craft circling around in various formations or going into the shore in waves and things. The 26th Marines was originally floating reserve. We went aboard ship the morning that morning, early morning, and got down in the landing crafts, and then we went out and circled, and we circled until I think maybe around noon or so, and then they got orders to go in. Well, by the time we got into shore, it was like maybe 2 o'clock. I wasn't paying much attention to the exact hour, but we got in the afternoon of D-Day. And the immediate thing that we found when we landed was how hard it was to get up that beach, because the island was a volcanic island, and the sand was sort of like a pebbles, crunchy stuff, and with a load on, you'd sink in the sand up this deep sometime, about halfway up your leg. It'd be hard to climb up those tourist places from one terrace to another. It was kind of tourist, and there was some firing at us too. They were shooting at us with mortar fire and with machine guns and small arms, and I wasn't thinking too much. It's strangely enough, I didn't feel real frightened. I knew people were getting killed all over the place, but and you'd see a dead Marine every once in a while. But they got them off pretty quick, and they got the wounded out pretty quick and out to a hospital ship.
Were you were on a LVCP when?
I was on the regular landing craft. LCVP, landing craft.
The door
vehicle.
went down on the front.
Yeah, and the door goes down the front. You go out that way.
When that door went down on the front, were you right at the front of the line?
No, I don't think so. I was sort of in the middle. They carried about 40 people or something like that, on those things. The landing craft vehicle personnel is what that stands for. And we went down and started. got our feet a little wet. And the guy did a pretty good job getting us into shore. And but then we began to try to climb up this place, and they were firing, and you'd fall down. And I chose to carry an M1 rifle because I was a pretty good rifleman, and that weighs about 9 pounds. And then I had about 100 or 150 rounds of ammunition belt, and then I had a canteen or two, and then I had a radio, a bag of batteries on the front of me, and I think another radio part on the back, and plus I had a light pack. I had probably about 70 or 80 pounds of weight, and that's what made it harder to get through that sand, I think, was all the stuff that I was carrying. And then when I got up there, and then we went to the CP, which was not very far inland, just
100 yards maybe?
Yeah, and no more than that. And there was a revetment where it looked like a U shape, and it was a U-shaped formation of just earth piled up, in like a U, which was apparently to put an airplane in or something like that. And we set up our first CP in that place. And the roughest time, the roughest shelling that I remember was that night when we were constantly being shelled by more.
That first night you were on.
First night on shore, yeah.
So when the boat dropped its front, how long did it take you to get from where the boat was to
the
where
CP?
CP was?
Well, it took, I don't know, it didn't take very long. It took maybe 20 minutes or something like that.
I see.
After we got out of that crunchy sand stuff, that black sand. And
Was the black sand only on the beach itself?
Yeah, it wasn't black all over, but it was black down at the beach. But the whole place was so blasted, I don't know where you can imagine, but a place that's been shelled and high explosives and big shells and everything for a period of time, the rocks get blasted all up, and nothing looks normal at all. It's a weird place. I'll tell you a little later about how our last command post was, where we were in a place where when it rained, the interaction between the rain and the sulfur or whatever was under the ground, it started at about a foot or two underground. And when you try to dig a foxhole, you couldn't sleep in that thing because it got so hot that you couldn't lie on it for any length of time without being blistered. So you couldn't dig your foxhole very deep in that place. It was a weird place, and when it rained, the ground steamed. It actually steamed. And if you wanted to heat food or heat water and make a coffee, instant coffee, you could bury your canteen down and dig a little hole about a foot and a half or 2 feet deep, cover it up, and leave it in there for a few minutes, and it would come out almost boiling. And it's as hot as you want it. That was a strange place.
During that run to the CP, did you feel any bullets come nearby?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I remember when I realized that they were playing for keeps, I was walking along about as close as I am to you now, and a bullet went right between us, And somebody was shooting at us. And sometimes it was just general fire, and they were shooting overhead and all that kind of stuff. But this one was apparently aimed at one of us, and it didn't hit either one of us. But that's when I realized how real it was, and that you could get killed down there. But I think we're lucky. I think we came at a time when the firing was at something of a low, so we were lucky to get through without. They had much heavier mortar fire later on the beaches.
How close was your CP, that first CP, to Mount Suribachi itself?
Well, it was. We were not the regiment that was attacking Suribachi. That was the 28th Marines. They went in here. They went in right next. They went across the island right toward the base of Suribachi, and then the 27th was attacking in here, and the 26th was in there to the right of them. So I guess, I don't know, the base of Suribachi, a little hard to define exactly where it was, but probably not over a couple hundred yards.
I see.
It was pretty close. And that thing was not very steep, you know, it was not a real steep, precipitous thing. It was very much a commanding location because so much higher than everything else. But the 28th Marines had the job of taking that.
Your CP sitting there not more than a mile from the hill.
Yeah.
Could you see Japanese artillery positions on
No.
top of that hill firing out?
No, you can't see them because, I mean, they did their firing. Well, I didn't see any anyway up there, and I wasn't looking at them. I had my own thing to do, trying to get my communications going, and all that. Set up my radio and check in with the division radio and that sort of thing.
What was your first message you sent?
Gosh, I don't know. I don't remember. We were you get in a military operation. What you have are several ways to communicate from one unit to another, especially if you're at the regimental level. So we had about 2 or 3 radio nets going, and the ones that they used more were the ones where they were talking. They used the talking nets, you know. And I first had a net that I was trying to set up with a key, you know, with that kind of communication with division. And we found out very, very quickly that wasn't very practical. So we didn't use that very long. We began to use the voice radios. I don't remember what the messages were, you know. Mostly it was just staying in touch. And those messages are used to transmit orders, and they would send them in different ways. And I tell you about the time where I used the telegraph. That was a little later in the operation. But in the beginning, almost everything was voice. And it could be voice because nothing was very far from anything else. Everything was close together. We had such a small foothold in Iwo Jima in the beginning there. You know, it took about 36 days, I think.
When you say voice, you talk about voice radio.
Yeah, voice radio. Yeah.
And it wasn't coded?
No, but we weren't sending important messages. Although when you get to smaller units, I've listened in on some of the units where the squads were communicating with the platoon leader, and the platoon leader with the company commanders, and it was pretty bad. You know, you could hear where they were getting killed and where they were having difficulties, where they were held up by machine gun nests and all sorts of things.
Were you contacting the ships at all?
No, I didn't. We didn't ever contact. I contacted only the division headquarters.
How far would the division headquarters?
Well, the division headquarters wasn't even ashore the first day.
Yeah.
They were still aboard ship, but they came in later. As we moved up the island a little ways, then the division had room to make them a headquarters. And I would be in contact with them one way or another every day that I was there, except when I was doing something else. I occasionally did some other things.
Did you shoot your rifle that first time?
I never got a chance to shoot at a Japanese person, which I would have been happy to do at that time. I mean, I thought that's why I had it. And there's one time I could have used it. One time when I was out with the chaplain's assistant, when I wasn't doing anything else, I would volunteer to go pick up Marine dead and bring them to a collection station. That's a very miserable job to do because they're often in bad state of repair. You know, they're all blasted. I saw a fellow who was burned completely all over, where he'd had a flamethrower on, you know, and had been struck by an incendiary bullet probably, and that caught on fire, and he just totally burned up. And you couldn't. The only thing he had on, only clothes that were on him was his shoes, leggings and shoes. And I've picked up a fellow whose head was all bashed off, and as I tried to carry him along, part of his brains were dropping on the ground, and it was pretty grisly work to do. And one time, this chaplain's asylum assistant and I were working, trying to locate some dead that we'd been told, or some dead that needed to be picked up. And we were in the area, but behind the front lines, you know, up in the sort of dead area between the rear the rear area and the front lines, which were moving a little bit all the time. And I didn't take my rifle that day. I mean, it's hard to carry a stretcher with a body on it and your rifle and your ammunition and all that stuff. So I thought, well, we won't see anybody shoot anyway. So we were walking along looking for dead people, and suddenly we came under fire of a Japanese machine gun.
Any clue where it was coming from?
No, not exactly. I mean, what we had to do right away is hit the deck, and we jumped in the shell hole. And we were then penned down, and we found out every time we got ready to get up, why the firing would start again. And it had been somebody who was bypassed. And the Japanese could come up in many places behind the front lines, you know. They had their underground tunnels and things ran from one end of the island to another, all over the place. And they had interlocking fields of fire where they would shoot at you from one angle and then from another angle. They had the island so zeroed in is what made it so bloody, is because they had people, and they were well protected in these tunnels and underground and pillboxes and all that sort of thing that they had. I was lucky in that I didn't have to assault those things.
So
Because my work
this
didn't
machine
require-
gun opened fire and you and the guy...
Well,
in the
they
shell
opened
hole-
up, and then we decided we had to make a run for it. So that's what we did. So we picked out a direction that we wanted to run to get back where we would be sheltered from that. And we started, but he was firing high, so he fired too high, and he didn't get us. And we got out of that hole and got back to a safer area. We never did find the bodies we were looking for. It was a little too risky. But that was one of the things that I remember. I'll never forget being pinned down by that machine gun. I'll never forget the bullet that came between me and the other guy too. That was very close.
How about that first night when the artillery hit you?
Well, that's one thing I never got used to, was artillery fire, because when those shells explode, pretty soon, if a mortar shell is coming, you can tell pretty soon by the noise it makes whether it's going to be close to you or not. It makes a different sound if it's coming close, because pretty soon you hear them coming and then you hear where they explode. And we were in the edge inside of this revetment that I told you about, this U-shaped thing in our first command post. I had a young guy from the message center who was in there with me, and we had a little shallow hole we tried to dig, and we couldn't get it. It was so sandy that we couldn't make a very good hole in it. So we were down like a foot or two, and shells were landing, and sometimes the explosion would be so close that hot pieces of metal would come over and hit the wall of our foxhole above where our heads were, and the hot metal would drop down on us and burn us. You know, you could feel the heat of that hot chunk of raw metal fall on you. That's a little bit unnerving too, and we were just lucky. You know, luck has everything to do with it when you're being shelled, because if you're in a pretty good hole, you're in better shape. And we quickly learned that the deeper and better you can dig your hole, the safer you feel.
But then you had to worry about the ground itself.
Well, but the ground wasn't that way everywhere. It was only in certain locations. That was not. I wonder if we could stop that from that.
You were talking about the battle.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things that happened, I don't know whether I told you this or not, but toward the end of the battle, we actually driven the Japanese farther and farther north, and finally there was very little resistance coming. And so the transports came to take us back to our base camp. And one of the things that I did, they then took me from the command post where I was and put me back to shore, and I set up a network. I set up a radio between shore and somebody out aboard the ship where our equipment and the people were going to be loaded onto. And that was down near, not too far from the foot of Suribachi on the west side of the island. And I went down there with one other fellow, and we put together a pup tent out of two shelter halves. And we were lying in there sleeping, I think about the last night that we were on the island. And suddenly a lot of firing began to take place, a lot of weapons being fired. And I didn't know what it was. Could hear bullets every once in a while zinging around. But I didn't think it was, I thought, these guys, because we were so far back from where the resistance was supposed to be. We were like a couple of miles from where the north end of the island, where the resistance might have been still some resistance. So I thought it was just some guys that were celebrating the fact that they had been told they were getting back aboard to go back to Hawaii. So and as I say, once in a while I could even hear a bullet whiz along. But the next morning I found out that what had happened is a bunch of Japanese had come out of a cave. 50, I don't know if it was 50 or 60 or 70 or something, a sizable number, but not a big group, you know. And they came out on a banzai charge, and they had their swords out, and they attacked the the tents where the pilots of the fighter group were sleeping, and they killed several of the pilots. And a lot of the Marines had turned in their ammunition, so they didn't all have ammunition left to resist these guys with, because they were no longer in a combat zone. So. But they finally killed these guys off. But that was one of the good chances I had maybe of getting killed without even knowing it. Because if they'd come down to where we were, we didn't even know what was going on. They could have just taken their sword and come in there and stabbed us or chopped us up pretty good, which is what they like to do. They like to cut people up with sabers and swords and things.
How far away was this attack from where your tent was?
Well, the attack couldn't have been very far because I could hear the firing pretty loud. I would say it was, like 30, 40 yards at the moment.
Really? That close?
Yeah, it was very close. We were down there near the airstrip, and I don't know exactly where the pilot quarters were because I never did see them actually sleep or anything.
Did you see the Japs the next day?
Well, I didn't bother with them. I guess they were there, but I didn't see it. There were not any Japanese right next to us. No, not that close. Thank goodness.
How many times did you move the
command post?
Command post.
We had 3 different command posts, 3 CPs.
How long did you stay in that first one?
Gee, I don't really know for sure.
A couple of days?
Oh, no, longer than that.
Oh, I see.
We stayed, when we got a command post set up, we stayed for like a week or 2 or something like that. The one we seemed to stay in, maybe the longest, was the last one that we had, which was pretty good ways up the island, and in a good location.
I guess you saw the B-29s coming in.
Yeah, and I saw the B-29s coming in. They were in there just a few days after we landed, because they immediately began to prepare that strip so that these crippled airplanes could land, and that's one of the reasons why they figure that the cost, which was like, I think the Marines lost about 7,000 men, or pretty close to 7,000 men killed on Iwo Jima or died of wounds. And but the Air Force, according to what I have read and also heard some fellow say, who was one who was saved by the fact that airstrip was made available for emergency landings, they saved over 20,000 lives of pilots who probably would have been lost because not being able to make it back to the Marianas where their base was.
Were you there when the flag was flown from top of the mountain?
I didn't see it right at the moment, but it was almost no time until everybody said the flag is on Suribachi, and then you could look up and see it. It was exciting.
Was there a bunch of, as the movie put it, all those horns going off on the ships?
Well, I didn't hear that. No, I didn't hear that. It might have been. I mean, there's war going on around you all the time, and you don't hear everything that everybody did. But it was exciting, and everybody was really happy about it. And
did you see any of the Japanese commit suicide?
No, but I've seen the ones that did. Their best way of doing it was to say to take a hand grenade and put it here. And when they do that, the whole insides are blown up, but they're just kind of opened up like that. I was very close to one in one of the places one of our CPs, where one corpse was, and they didn't bother with. What they did with the Japanese, I think, is they just pushed them in a hole after a while.
How about the smell?
The smell battle is bad. It's really bad. Some of these Marines that I picked up were so decomposed, and they hadn't been there too long, that the flesh would slough off in your hands, and it was bad. There are body parts lying around. Occasionally, you'd see a finger or a hand or something like that. Another thing you had to be careful about on a battlefield is there's a lot of unexploded ordnance. There's a lot of big shells lying around that didn't explode, and smaller shells and that sort of thing. I don't know why they weren't all buried deep, but they weren't. Some of them weren't buried deep, or they'd maybe hit and bounced or something. But people would get blown up every once in a while by something they stepped on, and so you had to be a little bit careful when you were walking around. I didn't go anywhere hard, to tell you the truth. I didn't meander all over the place. That's a good way to get killed, because there were bypassed Japanese that were looking for a chance to pick off somebody if they could.
Did you ever go into any of the caves? Or?
No, sir, and I would not do it. I have heard grisly tales of some guys who were captured and how they were tortured and all, the ones that were in the caves, and they heard them being tortured. And that's one reason why there's a lot of pretty bloody stuff that goes on in battlefields. That's not nice. But when you get friends that you lose, that you've learned to love and admire and so forth, and they're killed and tortured, you really worry about it.
Were you on the island when it was declared free?
Well, they declared it safe over before it really was. It really wasn't all over, but we got out of there, and there was a tiny little pocket, I think, that was still had some resistance, but for all intents and purposes, there's no use staying there longer.
But you were there the entire time?
Yeah. I was there from D-Day afternoon to... Actually, I went aboard ship later than most of the other people in my company, because I was down there with that radio set up.
Where did they send you after that?
Well, we went back to the base camp in Hawaii, our base camp at Camp Tarawa, to get reinforced, because we had lost a lot of men, and we had a lot of replacement people who were coming in and had to be integrated into the then we had to go through some more training, and we were all knew that the next operation would be the island of Japan, and we were dreading it pretty badly. So we had, from the time we got back, which was sometime in April, I guess, to until, well, one thing that I was very fortunate in having happened to me, of course I got promoted to sergeant, and the other thing was that I got a 5-day pass to go to the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in Waikiki, which had been, all during the war, an annex to the submarine base on around Pearl Harbor there. That was the headquarters of the sub force. And they took over the Royal Hawaiian, and when their men would go out on these long patrols, several weeks of patrols, they would come back in, and the crew would go into the Royal Hawaiian for some rest, some R&R. So I got an R&R pass because they had so little opposition that the submarines could hardly find anything sink anymore at that time of the war. So they let some Marines who had been in heavy combat go to that place, and I was able to go. And I went over there, and that's the only time I saw my younger brother during the war. But he had spent 2 years in Panama, and then he'd been sent to the northern part of Oahu on a radar. He was a radar officer. And when he found out I was coming to Pearl, we got together twice. We got together twice and spent a day together. And he was the first lieutenant, and I was a new sergeant.
Where were you when the atomic?
Well, when they bombed, when they bombed Hiroshima, I was back at Tarawa, and when we heard it, I said immediately, the war's over, because they can't take that. And of course, it wasn't over quite then, but it was a week later, you know, it was over.
A lot of people look back at the atomic attacks and say that Truman started something that he couldn't finish.
Let me tell you, we know that I think millions of lives, more than 1 million lives were saved. Because the Japanese were so devoted to I was so afraid not to resist, that they hardly ever surrendered, you know. And they were all going to fight. And they would have been bombed out, burned out, and everything else. They were burned out pretty well anyway by the bombers.
Do you consider the atomic blast saving your life?
Absolutely. I've said I don't believe I would have been here if we'd had to go through an invasion of Japan. And a lot of other guys feel exactly the same way, and so do many people that are at much higher levels and supposedly know more than I do.
You went to Japan after the war as occupation.
Yeah, we were the first troops in Sasebo. Sasebo is a naval base in southern Kyushu. And we didn't know exactly what would happen when we got there. So we went in combat loaded, just as if we were going to run into all sorts of opposition, but we had no opposition at all. Every Japanese sailor or whatever, you know, we saw mostly officers. We saw, as soon as they saw us anywhere close, they would bow to the half over as far as they could, you know, until you went by. They were very submissive, and so we went there, and our division split up into different companies in different places, and while we were there, we had a big typhoon hit the island, and we had several days of that where I thought they were going to blow the barracks down that we were in. They were wooden barracks, and I remember standing on the outside of one of these wooden barracks and watching the wind hit it, and I watched it bend for about a foot this way, and then when it would back up, it would come back in place. I thought that thing's going to break one of these times, but it didn't. It would give, but it wouldn't break. So we were there for a while, and then my regiment was detached from the 5th Division, and the last month or two I was overseas, I was in Peleliu. You know where Peleliu is?
Yeah, I've heard of
the
that.
Palau Islands. Well, this had been taken by the 1st Marine Division, Chesty Puller and some of his people, and a lot of other Marines, and it had, after the Marines had taken it and subjugated it, and then they went back to their base, and an Army regiment took over the garrisoning of that place, and they had built a camp. But these people were being reassigned to go to another similar assignment in China. These Army people were. So they took my regiment from Japan, and we went down to Peleliu, and I spent the last month or two in Peleliu.
We have about 30 seconds left on this tape.
All right.
Do you have any lasting feelings toward the Japanese?
Well, I think the Japanese have changed greatly since that time. They still have not fully admitted to all of their evil doings during World War II, but closer now than they ever have been. But at the time, I felt they were a foe who deserved to be hated, and we did hate them because, especially when you found out about all the things they did to prisoners. They were, but now I feel very, very good about Japanese, but I don't feel I've never been as sorry for those internees as some people were, because there were traitors among the Japanese, especially in Hawaii. And tell you one more funny thing. When we were getting ready to go to load up for combat, we were riding down from our base over on near the Parker Ranch to load up the ships, and nearly everybody you saw in Hawaii was Japanese. And these little kids were down there, and they would see you coming down, and they'd hold their fingers up like that. And somebody said,